Good morning, Highlands Presbyterian. On this last Sunday in August, we continue on through the Gospel of Mark, and we come to a familiar story of Jesus walking on the water. And this is right after Jesus has fed the crowd, and so there's talks. What Jesus does in the beginning is Jesus sends the disciples away in a boat, and then he goes up on the mountain to pray. And there's some thought that perhaps after this miraculous feeding of the 5,000, that the crowds were pressing in on Jesus, trying to make him a king. And so Jesus kind of sends the disciples away and goes up to pray to isolate himself, because the crowds had a very different idea of what it would mean for Jesus to be king than what Jesus is looking at, because we often want things that have results in the shorter term. Jesus is looking at a much bigger picture than we are. And Jesus' kingship is very different than what was expected. Jesus' Messiah is very different than what was expected. The salvation ultimately is bigger than anything we could have hoped for. But it's hard to convey that. And so we pick up in Mark 6 verse 45, and there's kind of this immediate transition. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while Jesus dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and Jesus was alone on the land. He saw they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, which is between 3 and 6 in the morning, it's kind of one of these so late that it's early, Jesus came to them walking on the sea. Jesus meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Jesus got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astonished, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Some years ago, Rachel and I were down in Florida, and we decided it was a great idea to take this sunset kayak trip. We apparently didn't think it all the way through, though, because it involved watching the sun set from the kayaks when the kayaks were still at a good distance from the car. And so what this translated to is there were just the two of us and the guide. We were kayaking back to the car, and it was dark, and there were no lights, and you could see about 6 feet in front of you, which meant you could barely see far enough to see the kayak in front of you. And we were in these backwaters, and it was dark, and we didn't know where we were, and we didn't know how to get back. And I was doing all I could to concentrate on the guide in front of me. Rachel was doing all she could to concentrate on me. And we made it back, and we were just exhausted. We were spent. We were overwhelmed with the exhaustion of trying to keep up in an unfamiliar circumstance, afraid of what might happen if we lost track of the leader. Maybe you felt this way at some point in your life. Maybe you've taken on a new job, and there's been all these duties coming at you, and you're not sure how you're going to make it through. You're still trying to figure out the responsibilities, and you're being handed more and more things to take on independently, but you're not sure what you're doing, and so you're trying to cling to your boss, to the leader, and you're worried, you're overwhelmed with trying to keep up, trying to keep sight of what you're supposed to be doing. Maybe it's with your first child, right? That first time when you have your kid and you take them home from the hospital, and you get home and you look at each other and you think, we are so unprepared for this. And the kid starts crying in the middle of the night, and you're like, I don't know what's wrong. And you're trying to keep up. You're reading all these different things, and you're calling people and asking for advice, and it's overwhelming. Or maybe now you're trying to homeschool your kids. Right? A lot of people are dealing with this of suddenly being thrust into the position of being a teacher. And you're not prepared for that. And you're trying to keep up and do right by kids, and you feel overwhelmed, and you're just trying to keep sight of those who are leading, trying to do the next right thing. In Mark's gospel, there are a few different instances where the disciples sort of become separated from Jesus. A few weeks ago, we read back when Jesus calmed the storm. They were kind of separated because Jesus was asleep in the boat and the disciples were awake, and they were very, very afraid, and they felt very separated from Jesus. There's this instance here in Mark 6 where Jesus has sent the disciples across the lake, and then the wind is rising up against them. And then later on in the Transfiguration, in Mark 9, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up the mountain. And when they come back down the mountain, they find the rest of the disciples are engaged in this argument with the scribes. There's all this turmoil around them. It seems as though whenever the disciples get separated from Jesus in any way, there is this opposition, there is this chaos that almost seems to engulf them, and it seems as though they become overwhelmed. They're trying to get by without Jesus in a way, but there is all of this opposition that rises up. And they have hints of Jesus and his power, but trying to make sense of the world kind of without Jesus. They're getting overwhelmed without his leadership there. And there's this concept in Mark referred to as the messianic secret. And basically throughout Mark, there's all these people who kind of, they see what Jesus is doing. The disciples are included in this, but they don't quite know who he is. They have hints at his power and at his presence and at his authority, but they can't quite put all the pieces together and see him as the Messiah. Again, because he's such a different Messiah than what people expected, people can't quite grasp that he truly is the Messiah, that he truly is the Son of God. And so his identity is sort of this secret. And there's all sorts of debate about why Mark does this. But I think ultimately it's very helpful for us because we are often at the same place. We are trying to follow Jesus, and we know we have big picture kind of who the Messiah is, and we know what is true about Jesus, but we're still trying to figure out the details about how exactly that fits into our lives. We're still trying and working every day to wrestle with the reality of brokenness, with the reality of the chaos in the world, with the reality of sin, both outside and inside of ourselves. And we're still working with that, trying to figure out who Jesus is. Trying to make sense of the world without God is overwhelming. And so we try to stay close to our leader, to our teacher, knowing that we need him. We need his strength and his protection for us. But we still wrestle with big questions that we have. Right? And the pandemic has made all of this even harder for us as we are more isolated. And remember what it says in 1 Peter, how the devil prowls around like a roaring lion. And we know anybody who's ever watched a nature show knows how lions hunt, right? They try and isolate the weaker individuals from the crowd, the prey. So they isolate the prey and then they attack because the prey is vulnerable when it's isolated. And we're all feeling a lot more isolated these days. And when we're isolated, it's easy to become overwhelmed with all of the questions, all of the trying to keep up, and all of the things that are pressing on us. And it feels like we're rowing a boat alone in a storm in the middle of a night, wondering, waiting, watching, worrying. Which is why the story doesn't end with the disciples alone in the midst of the lake, right? Jesus walks across the water and passes by the disciples. And verse 48 is interesting. It says, he meant to pass by them. Some people have read that as though he meant to pass by them without the disciples seeing him. I don't really buy that because I don't think it makes much sense. Jesus knew where they were. It was the middle of the night. I think if Jesus had wanted to walk by the disciples without them noticing him in the middle of the night, I feel like he could have found a way to do so. It's not like Jesus got surprised by much and would have thought, oh, look, there's the disciples in the boat. I think of it more as Jesus intending to pass by, is referring to an incident back in the Old Testament when God puts Moses in the cleft of a rock and God allows God's glory to pass by Moses. This is intended to be a moment of revelation of God's power and authority. This is in reference to Job 8 when Job is talking about how God trampled the waves of the sea. Jesus is again pointing back to the Old Testament as a way to refer to the disciples and help them to see who Jesus is, help them to see his authority over nature, help them to see his power. He's living the same things they would have learned about how God revealed God's self to us throughout human history. Jesus is reminding the disciples that the Bible is one story, and Jesus is the fulfillment of all those Old Testament promises. The disciples don't fully understand. Right? They're astounded, and when Jesus gets in the boat with them, the wind ceases, but we read that their hearts are hardened. They still don't fully understand what Jesus had previously done in the multiplying of the loaves and the fishes. Right? Jesus had been working his miracles right in front of the disciples, multiplying the loaves and the bread, demonstrating his power, but they still don't clearly see Jesus for who he is, despite his walking on the waves. Jesus was there, but the pieces didn't quite connect for the disciples. And it's clear they didn't work this out for some time, right? When Jesus is arrested, they all still abandon him because they're afraid. They're overwhelmed when they get separated from the leader. It's fair to say that we are in a bit of a headwind situation now, trying to row our boats, right? The natural world is certainly raging, right? This hurricane just swept up through Louisiana, and while it does seem to have missed some of the most densely populated areas on the Gulf Coast, it has still caused loss of life. It has still caused a great deal of damage as the storm has raged on. With this pandemic, we're still trying to find a vaccine, still trying to find a cure, still waiting for the green light to resume our lives as normal. And it's easy to feel overwhelmed in this. It's easy to wonder where God is in this. It's easy to be looking around saying, okay, where is our teacher? Where is our leader? Right, friends, faith is hard. Right, the disciples struggled to understand who Jesus was, and Jesus was physically right in front of them. They watched him walk on water. Jesus was revealing his glory to them, and they were still asking questions. And so it is okay for us to understand exactly how Jesus is at work in the here and the now. Extend some grace to yourself. It's okay to not fully understand the big picture. That is something that God can see, and we can trust that in the midst of the chaos of life, it's okay to not have all the answers. Right? To keep that perspective that from the midst of the storm, even in the relative peace of the eye of the storm, it's hard to see beyond anything how we're going to make it through the next day. Right? It's hard to have that big picture perspective. And so I think what we can take away from the story of Jesus walking on the water is that God wants to reveal God's self to us. Jesus chooses to reveal himself to the disciples here, even though the disciples don't fully understand, just as God revealed God's self to Moses. God wants to be fully known to us. that we may come to recognize that God has power over the natural world. That this may give us peace in the midst of the storms of life, whether these are hurricanes that rage or viruses that threaten. That God has authority over the natural world is something we need to hold on to. God will ultimately conquer all evil, including this natural chaos that threatens us. The time is not yet, but we can read these stories and know that we don't need to doubt God's authority and God's power over the natural world. And so as we are rowing our boats against the wind, we are invited to place our trust in Jesus Christ. And that it's okay to not fully understand everything, but trust that Christ has power over nature and that Christ intends to bring us safely home. And that in the midst of the storm, God chooses to reveal God's self to us, that we may be astounded, that we may find moments of peace, that we may not be completely overwhelmed. Let us trust in the abiding power and grace of Christ that comes to us in the midst of the night, in the late hours, in the dark, when we are afraid, and assures us that all will be well. Thanks be to God.